Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Outriders. I played it on the PS5, it's also available on the PS4, Xbox Series, Xbox One, Stadia, and PC. So let's start with the story of Outriders, which is you are an exploration group going to a new planet for colonization. Some shit goes tits up and everything's really cliche after that. Things are going tits up. The nerdy boss in charge turns out to be a complete asshole and he turns on you guys, you know, all the normal shit you're gonna run into. It turns into a post-apocalyptic war zone. You've got people fighting over resources. It's really very cliche. Which isn't to say that it is not serviceable, but pretty much anything that you would expect based on my explanation or based on reading anything about the story, you'd be like, oh, I know how this is gonna go, and it goes exactly that way. I will say there is one thing that I did really enjoy story-wise, and it's your main character has some good humorous bits. I felt that there were other parts that were supposed to be pretty funny and they just didn't land, but the main character, the humor and the remarks that they make when they're supposed to be funny, they're funny. But let's get into the audio, and the music is utterly forgettable. I barely remember that there is music in this game. The sound effects I actually like, and I think they work well with the world, the war, the futuristic elements. I think that plays very well, actually. But the voiceover work, on the other hand, that is, whew, man, there's some really poorly delivered lines throughout this game. It's almost impressive how they ride the line of being really shit and not quite being shit. That's basically how I would sum up the voiceover work in this game. Now let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and this is a third-person, cover-based shooter with RPG elements. There they are again. And since I brought it up right away, let's talk about the cover-based shooting in this game because, well, the shooting works. The cover, Why I say that is because, A, it's not as easy to maneuver around cover as, you know, a lot of other cover-based shooters out there, so it just feels crappy when you're trying to do that. But beyond that, and there are obviously certain areas where it's not meant to be cover-based, but in a lot of the areas where it is supposed to be a cover-based shooting action area, they just swarm you with enemies that completely ignore anything that makes cover-based shooting work. They charge you, and in most games, the guys charging you are generally the easiest ones to kill. Not in this game. They walk right up to you. They're the heaviest armored dudes. Putting them down before they're gonna put you out of cover is pretty difficult. And while you do eventually get used to it, it just feels like it completely negates the idea of this game being a cover-based shooter. So I found that just to be really weird and fly in the face of what this game was establishing itself as. But I will say I like a lot of the other enemies. Not the shooter enemies, but like the animal enemies that you can hunt and that are inhabiting certain areas. I think that's really cool. I actually like fighting them. I found them more interesting to fight than the human enemies. I will say this game's bosses didn't really impress me that much. I found most of them to be fairly easy. But I do like that you can up the difficulty of this game as you go through it by enhancing the world, or, you know, whatever they call it, which is basically just upgrading the difficulty. It really reminded me of Diablo 3, honestly, in that sense that you could so easily upgrade the difficulty. But the other element that I forgot to mention is it's very much a looter shooter, and it falls a little flat there, but it also succeeds a bit. It's kind of a mixed bag. I say falls flat because pretty much all the guns look the same, except for different colors. But I will say the variety of like what the different weapons do, and you know, you can get one assault rifle, you can get a new one that will be very, very different from it. So I did like that. I also liked the fact that your clothing will in fact alter your appearance. I think that's cool. I enjoyed that in pretty much all games. But let's get into a few things that I don't necessarily love, like the guide mechanic. I think it would be cool if it worked better, because it often guided me to a fast travel point, which was telling me to fast travel into a zone I hadn't fucking unlocked. That's useless as shit. Let's also address that this is a co-op shooter and there is no offline mode, so when my buddies didn't want to play, I was by myself and I couldn't go into offline mode so I could pause or things like that. Also, since there's no offline mode, you can't just leave this game for 12 hours and then come back to where you were. It doesn't work that way. Which leads to my next complaint, which is spending about 85% of the time getting into this game fucking waiting for it to sign in. There's something seriously wrong with this game when it comes to signing in. A, because it's always online, you have to sign in, so if you leave the game for too long, well, guess what? You gotta sign back in. I had a couple of times where I got booted and had to sign back in, or every time I wanted to play the game, I had to sign back in. So I ended up spending like 85% of the time trying to play this game signing back in. And there were times where it would just spin for like 10 minutes, and they tell you to wait for 10 minutes. I'm like, no, you guys need to get this shit fixed. Or they tell you to close out the game completely and try and sign back in, which doesn't always work. Also, weird small complaint, they have shotguns that are labeled as the slug variant. They do not throw slugs. Let's make that clear. They're still firing like buckshot. That being said, I will say when I was doing the firefights, when I was actually pursuing the quests and missions and all of that stuff, and, you know, doing the looter shooter kind of stuff, I actually had a pretty good time with that. There's just a lot of surrounding mechanics that kind of drag that stuff down. I should also add one thing that is kind of neat and unique to this game. Like most looter shooters, each of your class, you know, you can use all sorts of weapons, but you have special abilities. And the unique thing is not necessarily the special abilities, but the fact is that when you use those special abilities on enemies and then kill those enemies, that's how you gain health, or at least that's how my class worked. Or triggering certain special abilities meant every attack I did gave me health back for the damage I did to the enemy. So I will say, I think that is actually a fairly cool element. But let's get into the controls, which I gotta say, I like the controls. I think the controls work well. I didn't have any major complaints at any point in time with the aiming. I will say, I don't like the hip fire. It's a little too erratic when it comes to aiming. But when you're firing off the shoulder, you're actually aiming, it works really well. And I think using your powers and whatnot are really well done. Now let's get into the visuals, where I gotta say it's kind of a mixed bag. There are certain things in this game that do look very good, but there's plenty of stuff in this game that does not look very good. Now take into account I was playing on the PS5, so I was expecting much prettier things. But this game has, I will say, some really cool elements of the design. I think the outfits you get and the fact that they actually change when you change out your gear, I think that is really cool. I will say, I think the color schemes for the guns, they're really bright and obnoxious and neon. That doesn't make sense for the rest of the world that you are in. Like this post-apocalyptic world, and then you have like a neon green gun. It's weird and does feel kind of, not just kind of, but more than a little out of place. Now, unfortunately, I tried to capture a couple of these things, and then when I went back and rewatched my footage, they didn't happen in the capture, but they happened while I was playing. I had a dude who was just like, it looked like he was made out of static, like the old TV static, black and white. It looked weird and janky. But then there was another time in a cutscene where this dude was like, not completely, but partly see-through. I mean, I could see the environment through him. It was weird. He wasn't a ghost. He was supposed to be a real dude. So I don't know what that was about, but I did run into some other weird visual glitches, but very similar to those. But I am going to say this, and this is my biggest visual complaint with this game, and it really was very off-putting for me, the shaky cam. And it's not shaky cam during action and gunfights and gameplay, or any time that it would make sense to have shaky cam. Not that I really love shaky cam in general, but it's when you're having conversations. It just, the entire time, the camera is just kind of wiggling and waving for no reason whatsoever, and I don't understand it. Just imagine if every goddamn conversation was like this, where the camera was just wiggling just a little bit for no fucking reason. And that's every conversation in this game. Okay, so those things being addressed, let's get into the wrap-up. And I gotta say, overall, I didn't hate playing this game. I just ran into a lot of things that detract from the overall experience. One thing, and this is a personal thing, is I just don't like the shaky cam. So whenever that was kicking on, it got to a point where I was grabbing my phone and fucking around on my phone so that I could listen to what was going on, but didn't have to watch the shitty shaky cam stuff. As for the gameplay, I think it worked pretty well, so I do enjoy that, but all the other stuff holding that together is a little weak. So to put it simply, I'm not opposed to recommending this game, but I would never tell anyone to pay full price for this game. I paid full price for it, and I regret it, and that's why I do this, is so that you don't have to. So recommended, but at like 40 bucks or less. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me, what's your favorite sci-fi movie? You know, sci-fi game, sci-fi movie, why not? Let's do it. As always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.